What if the quietest person in the room knew the deepest truth? What if the woman everyone overlooked was the one who could bring an empire to its knees? She didn't dress to impress. She didn't speak to be heard. In a world of polished press releases and staged charity galas, Madeline Reese was just the CEO's secretary, a shadow at the edge of every boardroom, a name no one remembered. But when a single-party invitation sent half in jest landed in her inbox, everything changed, because behind her silence was a past she never spoke of. And across the mahogany floors of a winter gala, one man finally looked and truly saw her. What came next wasn't scandal. It was something rarer, a quiet storm of truth, trust, and a kind of love that didn't need to declare itself out loud. So, why did she really leave her high-profile career behind? Why did the CEO defend her after trying to forget she existed? And why, in the end, did one hand on a light switch mean more than any kiss ever could? If you believe the softest stories can be the most powerful, like share and subscribe. This is No One Believed the Secretary, until the Millionaire CEO's party changed everything. It had snowed the night before in Bend, Oregon, the kind of snowfall that softened even the harshest outlines as rooftops, sidewalks, even the sharp edges of the downtown buildings. But inside the corner office of Whitmore Properties, nothing was soft. Graham Whitmore sat at his desk like he always did. Shoulders square, posture exact, not a paper out of place. The room was quiet, as he liked it. Only the occasional hum of the heater and the ticking of a minimalist clock on the wall filled the air. He preferred efficiency over comfort, silence over chatter, and numbers over people. At 45, Graham had long stopped believing in things that couldn't be measured: productivity, quarterly growth, asset portfolios. Those were the things he trusted. He hadn't always been this way. Not exactly, but life, especially when lived under the microscope of leadership and public scrutiny, had a way of sanding down a man's softness. Years ago, he had believed in marriage, in loyalty, in doing good for the sake of it. But those ideals had been quietly folded away, like an old suit no longer in style. His divorce hadn't been messy, but it had been silent, two people retreating behind their own disappointments. No yelling, just a slow freeze, the kind you don't notice until everything is already covered in frost. He built walls, not with stone, but with silence and schedules. They worked. They kept the business booming and emotions out. So, when a local news blog published a half-buried report questioning the transparency of the company's community rebuild fund, Graham had reacted not with panic, but with irritation. The article didn't even have a byline. Sloppy journalism, he thought. Still, bad press was bad press, and shareholders didn't care about nuances. At the weekly executive meeting, the room was filled with crisp suits, polished confidence, and the kind of conversation that always hovered just above sincerity. Paige Duval, his director of communications and former flame, was already spinning solutions. A holiday fundraiser at the estate could pivot the narrative. She offered smoothly, elegant, charitable, exclusive. We show transparency, generosity, get the press involved in a controlled way. It's optics. Graham, optics heal faster than truth. He didn't flinch, just took a sip of black coffee that had long gone cold and nodded once. Fine. Have it here. Keep it small. Paige smiled like she'd won something, then started listing potential guest names, donors, press, local leaders, and, Graham added dryly, without looking up from his laptop, why not invite the secretary, to fill the room? Laughter rose around the table, short and knowing. Not cruel, but not kind either. Paige smirked. Which one? The new one. Madeline Graham didn't answer. He closed the laptop, his silence signaling the end of the meeting. As executives filtered out, Paige leaned in closer, her voice lowered. You do remember her name. He said nothing. And then, barely noticeable, she walked past the glass conference wall. Madeline Reese, hair pinned back simply, coat still dusted in snow from her short walk from the bus stop. She held a small stack of documents, her movements efficient, careful, invisible in the way only a certain kind of woman learns to be when the world doesn't expect her to take up space. Something in Graham's gaze paused. Just for a second, no one else noticed. He didn't even realize he'd been watching until the door closed behind her. Later that evening, Graham returned to the estate, his retreat in the pines above the town. The snow was thicker here. The long drive from the gate to the front porch was a quiet tunnel of bare trees and soft light from antique lanterns. Inside, the house felt colder than usual. He poured himself a glass of scotch, not out of habit, but because the silence tonight felt too sharp. He walked to the wide window in his study and looked out across the white blanketed grounds. Somewhere beyond the trees was the lake, frozen now, still. He remembered something his father once said: "Trust is the most valuable investment, son. But like any investment, it only pays off if you take the risk." Graham had taken that risk once. Marriage, love, friendship, each had shown him that belief was expensive, and the return rarely worth it. But as he watched the falling snow, his mind, uninvited, drifted back to the flicker of movement outside that glass wall, the woman in the gray wool coat, the soft tread of her boots, the way her eyes never met anyone else's, but always seemed to be listening. Madeline Reese. A secretary. Efficient. Quiet. Forgettable. If one wasn't paying attention. But something about her lingered, not her looks, not her clothes, just the way she moved, like someone who had once believed in something too, and was now simply tired of hoping anyone would believe her back. He set the glass down, untouched, and as the snow continued to fall outside the window, Graham wondered for the first time in a long time if trust was still worth anything in a world that only measured results. Maybe not. But something about tonight felt different. He didn't know it yet, but the walls were beginning to crack. Most mornings, Madeline Reese arrived at the Whitmore Properties building a full 20 minutes before the first pot of coffee finished brewing. She would park her old bike, its chain lightly rusted from the Oregon frost, in the side alley near the back entrance. A faded brown satchel swung across her shoulder, always the same, worn at the corners. She liked the quiet of early hours, no footsteps in the hallways, no clipped heels echoing, no eyes to interpret her silence as aloofness. To most people in the office, she was a fixture more than a presence. A polite nod here, a soft good morning there. She rarely joined the hallway chatter or the birthday cupcakes in the break room, not because she disliked people, but because it was safer to remain neutral, unseen. She wore sweaters in muted tones, skirts to her knee, and boots practical enough for snow, but quiet enough not to announce her presence. There was always a notebook in her hand. Not a laptop, just a plain, spiral-bound notebook with her tidy handwriting filling each line. She did her job precisely. Scheduled meetings, organized files, memorized Graham Whitmore's preferences so well that she no longer needed to ask. His coffee black, no sugar, reports indexed by deadline, then priority. He didn't have to repeat himself with her, something he clearly appreciated, even if he never said it. Most others saw her as dull, maybe even timid. Paige Duval saw her as unnecessary. She's quiet. Paige had once remarked in a meeting, half smiling, almost like she's afraid to speak. I suppose that works for some people. What she meant was Madeline wasn't a threat, not polished, not ambitious, not strategic, but what no one knew what Madeline never spoke of was that 5 years earlier, in Colorado Springs, she had been someone entirely different. She'd led a nonprofit there, a legal aid group for women leaving abusive homes. She'd spoken at town halls, managed teams, raised funding, stood in courtrooms beside women who couldn't afford an attorney. Her voice had been firm then, her steps sure, until one of those steps had taken her too close to a man with too much to hide. The fallout had been quiet but brutal. Funding pulled, allegations made none true, but all believable enough. She didn't fight back, she simply disappeared. That's how she ended up here, in Bend, in a modest apartment 2 blocks from the office, riding her bike in snow boots and wool gloves, starting over in a way that didn't look like starting anything at all. So, when the email arrived from Graham Whitmore himself inviting her to the annual fundraiser at his estate, she read it 3 times. No subject line. Just, "You're invited to the fundraiser at Whitmore Estate this Friday. Please RSVP by end of day. G.W." She stared at it like it might change. No one had ever invited her to anything like that, not in this version of her life. Not since she stopped being the woman in the spotlight. She'd built her world small now, on purpose. She didn't open the email again until lunchtime, then once more before heading home. It wasn't the invitation itself that unsettled her. It was the question behind it. Why now? It could have been a mistake, an oversight, a copy-paste list of names. But something in the way it was signed, just initials, short and certain, felt deliberate. She closed her laptop and went home in the early dusk. Snow was starting to fall again, slow and steady. Her apartment was warm from the radiator clicking to life. She heated a can of soup, watched the steam rise in coils, and let her mind wander, not to the party, but to the woman she used to be. There had been power in that version of herself, not the kind that made headlines or raised glasses at corporate events, but the quiet kind. The kind that made frightened women believe they weren't alone. The kind that had stood its ground even when the system pushed back. She'd lost that woman, or perhaps she'd just buried her beneath layers of self-preservation. The next morning, she printed the invitation and held it in her hands. The paper was thick, cream-colored, official. She ran her finger along the edge, then set it on her desk. All day. She answered emails, scheduled meetings, and organized data for the next board presentation. No one mentioned the fundraiser to her. Not a word. Not even Paige, who breezed past her desk twice with a smirk that said more than any comment ever could. At exactly 3:45 p.m. Mom. Graham walked by her desk on the way to a meeting. He didn't stop, didn't look, but she noticed his hand hesitate for a fraction of a second on the doorframe, then continue on. It was a pause small enough to miss, but she caught it. That evening, after most had left the office, she sat alone, the glow of her desk lamp casting warm light on the stillness around her. She reached for the invitation. Her decision had nothing to do with parties or appearances. It wasn't about proving herself or confronting anyone. It was about listening, watching, being in the room where things happened, instead of outside it. She slipped the invitation into her drawer, closed it softly, and turned her attention back to Graham's travel schedule for next week. Some decisions don't need announcements. They begin in silence. The snow had not stopped for days. By the evening of the Whitmore Estate fundraiser, the entire town of Bend was draped in white, the kind of white that made even the sharpest outlines blur. Streetlights cast a soft amber glow through the falling flakes, and the pines lining the estate's long driveway stood tall like silent witnesses. Inside, everything was warm light and polished elegance. The grand hall of the Whitmore Estate, rarely open to the public, now shimmered under the weight of soft gold chandeliers and candles perched in antique silver holders. Fireplaces crackled gently along the walls. Outside the tall windows, snow gathered on the panes like lace, filtering the world beyond into hush, the scent of cedar garlands mixed with roasted chestnuts and spiced wine. On every surface, buffets, end tables. The curved oak bar, there were signs of careful planning. White roses in low glass bowls, champagne flutes etched with the company's logo, menus printed on cream cardstock. A string quartet played Bach in the corner, notes crisp and composed. Paige Duval floated through the room like she owned it. She wore a crimson silk gown that caught the light with every step, her hair pinned in soft waves, her smile calculated to seem spontaneous. Every greeting she offered was practiced, every laugh calibrated. She greeted donors by name, kissed the cheeks of editors, and offered flutes of champagne to anyone whose camera mattered. This was her stage, her spotlight, and she shone like someone who had rehearsed this moment every night in front of a mirror. In contrast, Graham Whitmore stood near the fireplace, a half-full glass of whiskey in his hand, unmoved by the finery around him. He wore a black suit, no tie. His stance was still 1 foot slightly back, his gaze distant, tracking the flow of people as if watching a film he wasn't part of. He didn't do well in rooms like this. Too much noise masked his charm. Too many people touching his elbow, laughing at things he hadn't said. He had agreed to this only because silence would have spoken worse. But as the night wore on, he found himself withdrawing deeper into the space between firelight and shadow. Someone passed him a plate of hors d'oeuvres. He took one, barely noticed the flavor. He caught glimpses of old investors, new board members, tired press. But then, the music didn't stop. The candles didn't flicker. The snow didn't pause. Yet, something in the room shifted, like a thread quietly tugged loose. At first, no one noticed her. She entered quietly, from the side hallway. Alone, no announcement, no escort, just the soft rustle of a winter coat being folded over her arm. Madeline Reese. She wore a dress that didn't shimmer, didn't shout. It was ivory simple, pearl-toned, vintage in its lines, long sleeves, modest neckline, something out of another time, no jewelry, no statement clutch. Her hair was pinned back in the same way it always was, but something about her presence was different, still, sure, unhurried. She moved with the kind of grace that wasn't practiced, it simply was. A few people glanced her way and looked back, then did a double take, then again. A hush, not dramatic, not sudden, but unmistakable, began to ripple across the floor. Paige, across the room, blinked. Graham turned his head, not because he sensed the shift, but because something inside him had inexplicably asked him to, and when he saw her, he didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply watched. Watched the way her eyes calmly scanned the room. Watched the way she exhaled before taking another step. Watched the way she didn't shrink. She hadn't come to dazzle. She hadn't come to be seen. But the room saw her anyway. Not because of what she wore, not because of who she knew, but because she carried herself like someone who had walked through fire quietly, alone, and come out not needing anyone's permission to exist. Graham's fingers tightened slightly around the crystal glass in his hand. The whiskey, suddenly, tasted like distraction. She didn't approach anyone at first. She found a spot near the back of the room, beside the tall windows. The snow outside continued its steady descent. Inside, the music dipped into a softer key. Paige smiled tightly from across the room, then turned away, her grip on her wineglass just a touch too firm. Graham exhaled, slowly. He hadn't expected her to come. He hadn't expected her to look like this, not in appearance, but in presence. He had sent the invitation half in jest, half in curiosity. Now, standing by the fireplace, glass cooling in his hand, he realized he had underestimated her, not in the way men underestimate beauty or ambition, but in the deeper way, assuming silence meant absence. That invisibility was emptiness, but Madeline Reese was not empty. She was still, and that stillness spoke louder than any toast. As the guests continued to mingle and the music played on, Graham turned to look out the same window she stood beside, only several feet away. The snow was falling heavier now, and inside the warmth of his own estate, for the first time in a long time, something shifted in him. Not a leap, not a revelation, just a quiet recognition. That maybe not all storms announce themselves with thunder. The moment Paige Duval spotted her, something in her expression shifted, not immediately, not dramatically, but enough. She had been mid-conversation with a local developer when her eyes caught the figure in ivory standing near the window, soft light tracing the edge of her profile. Madeline Reese. It took Paige a few seconds to place her. The transformation was subtle, not cosmetic, but unsettling nonetheless. She wasn't supposed to look like that, not poised, not calm, not visible. There had been a certain safety in Madeline's invisibility, a predictability. Paige liked knowing the rank of the room, who mattered, who didn't. But now, that neat hierarchy had been disturbed. She excused herself with a practiced smile and walked toward her. The sound of her heels, sharp, precise, cut through the murmur of conversation. Madeline turned slightly, offering a polite nod. "Madeline," Paige said smoothly, holding her wineglass with 2 fingers and just enough condescension to feel like perfume. "You clean up? Unexpectedly well?" Madeline simply smiled. Paige's voice lowered, almost confidential. "I didn't know this kind of event was your comfort zone, the estate, the guests people like these." There was no overt insult, just layers of implication. That Madeline didn't belong, that she didn't understand the room, that she was, at best, a well-dressed error in someone else's guest list. A few people nearby turned slightly, sensing a ripple. Madeline glanced at the stem of her glass, then up at Paige, her voice calm, measured like a melody only she could hear. "Some of us don't need comfort to be useful, just purpose." The sentence landed softly, but its echo spread wide. The music didn't stop, but a quietness took over the immediate circle around them. A few low chuckles more like exhales passed between guests who had been pretending not to eavesdrop. Someone near the fireplace raised an eyebrow. Paige's smile faltered, just a hair. She blinked once, then gave a tight, dismissive laugh and turned away. Madeline didn't gloat, she didn't move. She just sipped her drink and returned her gaze to the snowfall outside. But across the room, Graham Whitmore had seen it all. He hadn't meant to stare, but the subtle shift in the energy of the party, the way it bent, even briefly, around a woman no one had planned to notice had caught his attention. She had said almost nothing, but something about the way she stood her ground, not with volume, but with clarity, stirred something in him he hadn't expected. He set down his drink, and for the first time since she'd started working in his building, he walked directly toward her. No clipboard. No scheduling concern, no document to sign, just him. As he approached, Madeline turned slightly, registering his presence with that same quiet dignity. She didn't smile right away. She didn't flinch. Her eyes held his not defiantly, but steadily, like someone who had nothing to prove, but also nothing to hide. "Ms. Reese," he said, voice even, hands at his sides. She nodded. "Mr. Whitmore." They stood for a moment in the kind of pause most people try to avoid, but neither of them filled it. They simply let it breathe around them. The party continued, glasses clinking, violins playing, polite laughter weaving between conversations, but for that small space of time, it all felt very far away. He studied her face, not the way men study beauty, but the way a man looks when something familiar suddenly becomes new, or perhaps finally comes into focus. Her presence, he realized, had never been small. He had just never been quiet enough to notice. "Thank you for coming," he said at last. She gave a slight tilt of the head. It was a thoughtful invitation, a beat past. "I meant it," he added, more to himself than to her. She didn't ask what he meant. She didn't need to. In that stillness, something shifted again. Not romance, not confession, just recognition of capacity, of depth, of a different kind of strength than the room was used to celebrating. She turned back toward the window for a moment. Snowflakes pressed against the glass like scattered whispers. Her reflection there was soft, barely visible, yet more grounded than anyone else in the room. Graham followed her gaze. They stood side by side now, not touching, not speaking further, but oddly aligned, like two people who, despite everything, had somehow ended up in the same moment. Paige, from a distance, watched them, her glass now nearly empty, her posture still perfect, but her eyes narrowed, calculating, and Madeline. She felt none of it. She didn't need to win the room. She didn't need the room to see her. She had walked in without fanfare, without armor, without agenda, and still managed to become the quiet center of it all. She had spent years shrinking herself to avoid notice. But perhaps some places, some nights, some silences don't ask you to shine. They just need you to be present. And this, she realized as she folded her hands gently in front of her, was one of them. The article wasn't meant to make waves. It appeared on a quiet Sunday morning, buried halfway down the lifestyle section of the Bend Herald. Not front page, not even bold font. Just a soft headline nestled between a review of a new bistro and a piece about winter hiking trails. A night of grace at Whitmore Estate. Most readers skim past it, just another recap of another wealthy fundraiser with polished photos and polished praise. But for those who lingered, especially those who knew how to read between the lines, something felt different. Near the bottom of the article, after listing donors, describing the decor, and noting the wine pairing menu, came a paragraph that stood out like candlelight in fog. Among the guests was Madeline Reese, assistant to Mr. Graham Whitmore, whose quiet presence was described by several attendees as surprisingly magnetic. Those with sharp memories may recall Ms. Reese's earlier work in Colorado Springs, where she served as project coordinator for Haven Legal, a nonprofit assisting women in crisis. It's rare to see such substance walk so softly, but perhaps that's the kind of strength we need more of these days. Less noise, more truth. A single photo accompanied the note. Grainy, taken at a distance, but unmistakable. She was standing near the tall windows, snow behind her. Face turned slightly in thought. That was all, but it was enough. By Monday morning, the office air felt different. Not tense, not loud, just aware. Conversations hushed slightly when she passed. Heads turned quicker than usual. Compliments were softer, more curious. Paige felt it immediately. The shifting temperature in the room, the subtle pull of attention she didn't command. The way people looked toward Madeline, now not as a background fixture, but with the curiosity reserved for people with stories. Paige hated stories she hadn't written herself. She clicked the article link again and again, her smile tight as she read the words. Magnetic. Strength. Truth. Words that should have belonged to her. She had shaped the entire narrative of that party, down to the positioning of centerpieces, and yet here was this. Footnote. This shadow. This nobody. Taking up space she hadn't been granted. It gnawed at her. By mid-morning, she was already rewriting the internal press release. She added her own quotes, underlined donor names, ensured the media coverage highlighted strategic leadership over mystery guests. But still, the picture lingered. She printed it. Tapped it against her desk, and called someone she hadn't spoken to in years. Someone who knew how to find things. Graham, meanwhile, sat in his car just outside the office parking lot. It was 7:43 a.m. He hadn't gone inside yet. The frost on his windshield had cleared. The heater was humming, but he stayed parked, thumb hovering over his phone, eyes focused on the article open before him. He read it once, then again, then just stared at the photograph. There was something in Madeline's posture in that image stillness, without stiffness, awareness without fear. It wasn't posed, it wasn't meant for attention, but it carried weight. He zoomed in slightly, his finger resting gently on the screen. Not to touch her, but to understand. He hadn't known about her past work, hadn't bothered to check. She had been a name on a resume, a calm presence, an efficient organizer, but this woman in the paper, she had been something else entirely, someone with edges and fire, someone who had stood for things. He opened her HR file on his tablet, scanned through the dates, the positions, the degrees. There it was. Haven Legal Services, Program Director, 2016-2019. No explanation for why it ended, no references from that role, just a clean break in employment, followed by scattered admin work in small towns, a trail that faded like footsteps in snow. He leaned back in the seat. Why would someone leave that kind of work? No scandal attached, no news stories, just silence. People don't disappear without reason, and people don't bury themselves unless they've been burned. He closed the file and sat there a while longer, letting the quiet fill the cabin. Inside the building, the day had already begun. Phones ringing, keyboards tapping. the low murmur of productivity humming through the halls. But Graham wasn't thinking about numbers. He was thinking about the photo, about the look in her eyes, and about the story she hadn't told. At that same moment, 2 floors down, Madeline sat at her desk. She hadn't brought up the article, hadn't acknowledged the glances or the softened tones in how people addressed her that morning. She answered emails, filed schedules, reviewed notes for Graham's midweek briefing, but the truth was she had seen the article. Someone had texted it to her early Sunday, without comment. She had read it in bed, curtains drawn, morning light filtering in through frost-covered glass. And she had cried, not because of what it said, but because of what it remembered, the name of the program, the town, the woman she used to be. Not everyone had forgotten, and maybe that mattered more than she thought. Still, she told no one, because some memories weren't meant for office gossip, and some stories were still too tender to speak aloud. So, instead, she filed another report, and quietly braced for what she didn't yet know was coming. The meeting room on the 12th floor had never been so quiet. Not even during investor reviews or market downturns had silence pressed this heavily against the glass walls. The usual hum of fluorescent lights seemed louder today, as if every detail of the room was holding its breath. Everyone was present: marketing, finance, communications, operations, and at the center, Paige Duval, standing like she was preparing to deliver a keynote instead of a blow. She wore black not out of mourning, but power. Her heels clicked once against the polished floor as she stepped forward, holding a slim folder in one hand and a printed document in the other. Graham sat at the head of the table, jaw tight, fingers laced in front of him. He had been told this was a clarification meeting. Paige had insisted it couldn't wait, that there was something urgent and reputational to be addressed. But he hadn't expected this. No one had. Paige cleared her throat. "There's been a development," she began, voice smooth, eyes scanning the room. One we felt the leadership team should be aware of, given the sensitivity of our current media exposure. She held up the document like it weighed more than paper. "This morning, I received confirmation that an employee of ours, Ms. Madeline Reese, was previously employed by Haven Legal Services, a non-profit currently involved in litigation against several real estate developers for fraudulent charitable use of funds." A murmur stirred, then fell flat. She was part of their leadership during the time of the alleged incidents. And though she left before the lawsuit was filed, her name appears in early correspondence, some of which I have here. She placed the document down in front of her, deliberately. Given our current scrutiny and the optics of such a connection, I believe it's critical we ask for transparency. She turned. Madeline sat calmly at the far end of the table, hands folded in her lap. She had not flinched once. Not when her name was said. Not when the accusations landed. Her eyes remained steady, voice quiet when she spoke. "Yes, I worked at Haven. No apology. No panic. Just truth. I was there for 3 years. I left when I began to question the integrity of certain cases we were pursuing, especially when I realized some of the people we were accusing weren't as guilty as we thought." She let the sentence rest. It didn't justify. It simply existed. "I didn't stay to clean it up," she added. "I chose silence. Maybe that was weakness, maybe not." No one spoke. Even Paige, momentarily caught off guard, held her breath as if waiting for the rest. But there was no rest. No pleading, no defense. Only Madeline, still, unflinching. Graham looked at her, his voice low. "Why didn't you tell me?" Madeline met his eyes. "Because I knew how it would sound, and because I thought maybe here I could just be who I am now, not who I was." Another pause. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope. No logo, no label. Just his name in handwriting, clean, slanted, unmistakably hers. She stood. "This is for you," she said simply. "I don't need you to believe me. I just need you to read." Then she walked out. No dramatic turn, no last word, just quiet steps and the soft sound of the door closing behind her. Paige looked satisfied for a moment, until Graham picked up the envelope and began to open it. Inside were 3 pages. One was a copy of a wire transfer. Another, a signed memo from 2 years ago on Whitmore letterhead. The third was a printed email, internal, from Paige, her name, her signature, her timestamp, and instructions subtle, but clear to reroute unused community funds from a small initiative to a higher visibility partnership with branding opportunity. Not illegal, but unethical enough. Enough to suggest misdirection. Enough to imply misuse. Enough to mean she had known. He read it twice, then a third time. The room was silent again, but this time, not from shock, from shame, from the slow, dawning understanding that the person they had ignored had seen what they hadn't, had protected them, even when she had no reason to. Graham folded the pages, placed them back in the envelope, and set it on the table. His hand rested there for a long moment, as if unsure whether to grip it or let it go. He didn't look at Paige, didn't need to. She had already turned away, her spine rigid, the crack in her foundation beginning to show. Graham leaned back, staring through the glass at the city below. He didn't know what hurt more, the fact that he had been deceived, or that he had let someone leave, unprotected, when all she had done was tell the truth. The office was nearly empty by dusk. Outside, the snow had started again soft at first, then steady, then thick as breath on cold glass. It pressed against the windows of the 12th floor like time itself had slowed down. Graham hadn't moved in hours. The envelope still lay open on his desk. The papers inside, now read, reread, and gently smoothed from their earlier creases, rested under the soft circle of light cast by his desk lamp. Each page had something more than information. They carried something heavier than evidence. They carried intent. Madeline's handwriting appeared only in margins. Thin, clean letters, notations in pencil. On one page, double-checked totals. Doesn't align. On another, Paige approved this. Seems misclassified. And on the last page, almost hidden near the bottom, under a financial summary, delete before submitting. Underlined twice. Graham leaned back in his chair, letting the words settle in his chest, not as accusations, not even as proof, but as truth. He remembered the meeting, months ago. The boardroom was warmer then, sunlight pooling on the long table. Paige had been speaking confidently, too confidently. "We don't have time for boutique charity projects," she had said, sipping her espresso. "Stick with the big names. The rest is just PR noise." At the time, he'd nodded, dismissed the thought, and now, under the flicker of lamplight and snowfall, he wondered how many truths he'd let pass by like that, soft, inconvenient, ignored. The heater in his office clicked on, filling the silence with a low hum. He opened the second item. Madeline had left a note, handwritten on thick, ivory paper. No greeting, no goodbye, just a few simple lines. "I don't need you to believe me. I only need you to believe the truth. Whatever you choose next, let it come from that." Her signature followed, small, almost hesitant, like it had been a long time since she had signed anything that mattered. He read it 3 times. The storm outside had intensified, gusts sweeping across the building, snow carving slow patterns against the glass. From this height, the lights of Bend, Oregon looked blurred and scattered, like stars that had drifted too low. He stood, crossed the office, and looked out over the town. For the first time in a long while, he felt the weight of everything he didn't know, not as failure, but as clarity. Because knowing nothing meant he could finally choose to know something true. He returned to his desk, opened his laptop, and began typing. By morning, an internal memo would reach the executive board. Effective immediately, Paige Duvall was suspended pending independent investigation. Effective immediately, Whitmore Properties would invite third-party auditors to review the Community Renewal Fund. Effective immediately, Graham Whitmore would oversee all philanthropic efforts until trust could be restored both internally and with the public. He hit save, then print, then signed it, not with flourish, not with emotion, just with finality. Outside, the snow continued to fall thick, relentless, quiet. Streets were empty, headlights moved slowly. The town had gone to sleep early, as it always did when storms rolled in from the Cascades. But Graham didn't go home. Instead, he took the long road out of the city center, winding past shuttered cafes and snow-covered rooftops. His SUV cut through the drifts steadily, the heater humming low, windshield wipers sweeping rhythmically. He didn't turn on the radio, didn't need the noise. He was following something else, something quieter, less certain. He didn't know exactly where she lived, but he remembered her mentioning the neighborhood, close enough to ride her bike, a red brick building with ivy on the side, near the old train crossing. She'd said it once, casually, when rescheduling a meeting around a local power outage. He hadn't been listening carefully then. He was listening now. As he turned down a narrow street near the train tracks, his headlights caught a familiar shape, a bike, leaning against a railing, its frame dusted with snow, the chain half rusted, the seat tilted slightly forward, like it had been adjusted often, but never quite right. He parked, stepped out into the cold. The snow hit his coat immediately heavy, soft, clinging to the shoulders. His breath fogged in the air. The building was quiet, no light in the front windows, no footsteps behind the door, but he stood there anyway. He didn't knock, not yet. He just looked up at the second-floor window. No curtain moved, no shadow crossed, but he hoped, and for the first time in years, Graham Whitmore wasn't trying to control the outcome. He wasn't calculating risk, measuring optics, scanning projections. He was just waiting, hoping, learning how to listen. Finally, in the silence. The chairs were metal and mismatched. The overhead lights buzzed slightly, casting a soft yellow glow over the modest room. Folding tables along the back wall held coffee in styrofoam cups and stale cookies wrapped in napkins. A chalkboard still bore remnants of a school notice from the day before. It was the kind of place no one photographed, and yet it felt more honest than anything Graham Whitmore had stood in for years. He arrived late, on purpose. He didn't want anyone to notice him, especially not her. He slipped in quietly through the back entrance, coat still damp with snow, boots carrying traces of gravel from the parking lot. There were maybe 30 people in the room, older couples, young volunteers, a few students with notebooks, people who weren't here for headlines or networking, but for the quiet labor of listening. At the front stood Madeline. She wasn't dressed for attention. A soft gray sweater, hair tucked simply behind her ears, no microphone clipped to her collar. She stood behind a wooden podium that wobbled slightly when touched. Her hands rested gently on its edge. No slides, no pitch, just her voice. The truth is, she was saying, when you lose trust in a place you once believed in, it doesn't just disappoint you, it disorients you. You start asking yourself if your instincts were ever reliable, if your judgment was ever clear. She paused, not for drama, but breath. In those moments, rebuilding isn't just about policies or audits. It's about choosing, every day, to believe that good still exists, even when it's quiet, even when it comes in a form you didn't expect. Graham stood in the back, hands in his coat pockets. He watched her not as the woman from the office, not as the figure in the article, but as someone who had walked away from noise and still found a way to speak. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't gesture grandly, but each word settled gently into the room like snow on pavement, soft, steady, undeniable. She spoke of accountability not as punishment, but as healing. She spoke of community not as branding, but belonging. And she spoke of silence not as weakness, but as choice. Graham felt something shift in him again, not like the snap of realization, but the slow settling of dust after years of motion. Madeline didn't look toward the back of the room, not at first, but when the final words of her talk echoed into stillness, and the modest applause began genuine, not orchestrated. Her eyes scanned gently across the crowd. They landed on him, and in that brief second, she acknowledged him with the smallest nod, not cold, not warm, just true. It was enough. She turned back toward the podium to gather her notes. Graham didn't move. He didn't walk forward, didn't ask to speak with her. He simply stood in the presence of something he had misjudged and chose not to interrupt it. Let her have this moment without making it about him. Let her speak without demanding to be heard. When the crowd began to disperse, he quietly exited the way he came. The snow outside had softened. The storm had passed, leaving behind a hush that felt almost like reverence. He drove home in silence, not the silence of guilt, but of clarity, of purpose. At home. He poured a single cup of coffee, no whiskey, no fire. He sat at the large oak desk in his den, the one he hadn't used for anything meaningful in months, and opened a blank notebook. At the top of the page, in block letters, he wrote Whitmore Community Renewal from the ground up. He underlined it once, then began writing. Not numbers, not goals, but questions. What would it look like to let community members lead? Who decides what impact means? How can transparency be practiced, not just promised? He wrote slowly, thoughtfully. The snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the world in softness. He paused only once to glance at the envelope Madeline had left days earlier, still resting on the edge of the desk. He didn't open it again. He didn't need to. The letter had done its job. It hadn't asked for forgiveness. It hadn't begged for redemption. It had asked him to believe in truth and build something from it. And he would, not for headlines, not to win her back, but because now, for the first time in years, he understood. Some people carry integrity not like armor, but like breath. Unseen, essential, no subject line, just a sender she hadn't heard from in weeks. Graham Whitmore. Madeline stared at it for a moment, her fingers paused above the keyboard. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, but the first lines of light were softening the edges of the window beside her desk. She hadn't slept much the night before. Something in her bones had been restless, waiting. Now she knew why. She clicked it open. The message was brief, uncharacteristically so. No formatting. No corporate signature, just text. There's a space I want to build something useful. A legal resource center, funded by Whitmore Properties but operated fully independently. I want you to lead it, then, on a new line, separated from the rest. If you still believe in anything, let's start again. She read it once, then again, and again. Not because she didn't understand it, but because it said so much in what it didn't say. There was no apology, no defense, no manipulation, just the offer of something new, and the silence to make her choice. By mid-morning, she had drafted a reply, deleted it, then tried again. Finally, with the snow still gathered on her windowsill, she typed slowly, "If this is real, if I will have full autonomy, full hiring rights, and no cameras. If my name will never appear in a brochure, then yes, but only then." She didn't say thank you. She didn't ask what changed. She didn't need to, because the work had to stand on its own, not as redemption, not as romance, as something worth doing because people needed it. 2 days later, they met at a small cafe off the edge of downtown Bend. It was the kind of place with chipped mugs, handwritten menus, and a bell that jingled when the door opened. Not upscale, not curated, just honest. Graham arrived first. He wore his usual charcoal coat, scarf tucked with the kind of effortlessness that looked practiced but wasn't. He was holding 2 cups when Madeline walked in. She paused at the door, not because she hesitated, but because something about the image struck her. The man who had once been a fortress now looked quieter, less polished, less certain, more human. He saw her and gave the smallest nod. She approached. He handed her a cup. "Hazelnut, no sugar," he said. She arched an eyebrow. "You remember that." He looked almost embarrassed. "I read it on one of your old staff preference forms. HR keeps weird notes." She smiled, not at the coffee, but at the fact that he'd looked. They sat by the window. Outside, the streets were beginning to clear of snow, the slush making lazy rivers along the curbs. Inside, it was warm, Not because of the heat, but because nothing needed to be proven. They didn't talk about the boardroom, not about Paige, not about trust broken or letters sent. Instead, Graham pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket. "It's a draft floor plan," he said. "The community hall is donating half of their underused wing, rent-free. I want to keep the space local, close to the people it's for." Madeline leaned forward, studying it. Her finger traced the outline of the main lobby. "This is too narrow. Clients will feel crowded." He nodded. "Noted." She pointed to the office cluster. "And this, can we add a kids area? A lot of women I used to work with had no childcare. They stopped coming for help." He didn't hesitate. "Yes." There was a long pause. Then she asked, "What color are the walls now?" He smirked, a mix of beige and defeat. She laughed gently, unexpectedly. "Then we'll fix that first." He looked at her, not as a leader reporting to him, not as a secretary seated outside his office, but as someone building something he could only hope to understand. Someone who knew what mattered, because she'd lived through what didn't. And in that moment, for the first time in what felt like years, he smiled. Not the polite one, not the practiced one, but the real one creased at the eyes, soft at the corners, like something long frozen inside had finally remembered how to thaw. And Madeline. She saw it, and without meaning to, she smiled back. Not because everything had been healed, but because something new had begun. Healing doesn't come in applause or headlines. It comes in freshly painted walls, late-night coffees, and quiet teamwork. The smell of paint still lingered in the air. Faint but warm, like something new was trying to be born through old walls. The first morning light slipped through the tall windows of the converted community wing, now, officially but quietly, home to the Whitmore Legal Resource Center. Except no one called it that. The sign outside simply read, "The Corner Desk," a name Madeline came up with after watching a single mother spend hours in the waiting area one day, filling out a housing appeal form from the edge of a folding chair. She deserves more than a clipboard, Madeline had said. She deserves a corner, a desk, a place to feel seen. Graham hadn't argued. He rarely did these days. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he was learning when not to speak. The walls had been painted a soft moss green, chosen after a week of back-and-forth debates between Madeline's preference for warmth and Graham's inclination for neutrals. They argued about lampshades, filing systems, whether to use ceramic mugs or paper cups, whether kids' coloring books should be in a bin or a bookshelf. And yet, somehow, every disagreement ended the same way, with a nod, a half smile, or a shared joke about how lawyers are harder to manage than toddlers. Trust wasn't rebuilt in declarations. It was rebuilt in details, in showing up on time, in asking before deciding, in saying, "You were right," even when it stung a little. The town began to notice, not through press releases or events, but through people. The woman who received help with a restraining order and returned weeks later with cookies. The retired teacher who now volunteered to help with paperwork every Thursday. The teenage boy who sat quietly in the corner, offering to fix the center's Wi-Fi every time it glitched. The whispers weren't of scandal anymore. They were of service, not flashy, not loud, but real. Madeline had changed too, not drastically, not in ways anyone else might notice at first glance, but there was more light in her eyes now. A looseness in her shoulders, a quiet confidence in the way she spoke, no longer as someone shrinking from the past, but as someone walking steadily through the present. She stayed late most nights, sometimes because the work demanded it, sometimes because the silence after hours was comforting. She brewed coffee too strong, forgot to eat lunch, wrote notes on sticky pads and left them on Graham's desk with arrows and exclamation marks. And Graham. He read every single one. He still wore suits, but sometimes without a tie. He still checked reports, but let others make the first draft. He still sat in the corner office, but the door stayed open. The transformation wasn't sudden. It was slow, uneven, but steady. One evening, long after most had gone home, the center remained lit by just 2 desk lamps and the faint glow of winter's early sunset. Madeline was bent over intake forms, sorting through stacks of paper, red pen in hand, eyes tired but focused. Graham watched from the doorway, a takeout container in each hand. "I brought Ty," he said gently. She didn't answer, not because she was ignoring him, but because she had fallen asleep. Her cheek rested on the side of her forearm, pen still loosely held between two fingers. Her breathing was soft, steady. A loose strand of hair fell across her face. Graham stood there for a long moment, unsure of what to do. Then, without a word, he set the food down, removed his coat, and stepped quietly behind her chair. He lifted the coat carefully and laid it across her shoulders, tucking it in gently so it wouldn't slide. Then he sat, not in his usual chair, but next to her, close enough to hear her breathe, far enough not to disturb her. He didn't check his phone, didn't glance at the clock. He just stayed, and as the evening folded into night, Madeline stirred. Her eyelids fluttered, but she didn't open them. She shifted slightly, just enough to lean, almost imperceptibly, against his arm. Her head found its place against his shoulder. No words, no explanations, just a shared warmth in a quiet room where nothing needed fixing and nothing needed defending. Only presence, only peace. The folding chairs were newer this time. So were the tablecloths. The posters had been hand-painted by local students. The cookies were baked by volunteers. There were name tags, floral centerpieces, and a banner that read, "1 year of service, 1 year of stories." It was exactly the kind of celebration Madeline would have quietly skipped if she hadn't been gently persuaded by nearly everyone involved. Graham hadn't pressured her. He simply said, "You should be where the impact is felt." She didn't answer. But the morning of the anniversary, she arrived early, dressed in a navy blue sweater and pressed slacks, clipboard in hand, checking the sound system and the seating chart like it was any other workday. The community hall buzzed with soft music, low chatter, and the smell of warm cinnamon. Near the front sat Paul Grayson, a journalist whose earlier column had once sparked rumors and who, to his credit, had stayed curious in quieter ways. This time, he wasn't writing gossip, he was profiling change. The event began with stories short, real, unscripted. A grandmother who'd fought eviction, a single father who had found custody stability, a teenager who now volunteered 3 days a week, because it feels like hope here. No one cried, but everyone listened. And then, Paul was invited to the stage not to report, but to ask. He sat across from Madeline and Graham at a small table, center stage, no spotlight, just the warmth of shared presence. His questions began softly. "What surprised you most in the last year?" Madeline answered first. "That healing takes longer than planning. That not everything broken needs to be replaced," Graham added. "That you can run a center with no titles on doors and somehow everything still works." Laughter stirred through the audience. Paul leaned in, smile lingering. "And what about the two of you?" he asked lightly. "There's been a lot of quiet speculation. Are you more than colleagues?" The room shifted, not unkindly, just curiously. Madeline didn't flinch. She smiled, folded her hands in her lap, and replied, "We drink bad coffee. We argue about font sizes. We fix the printer, and we help people neither of us knew last year." Pause. "That's all?" The audience chuckled, warmly. Then Paul turned to Graham. "And for you," Graham looked at the crowd, then at Madeline. He didn't blink. "I don't know if this is love in the way people expect it to be," he said slowly. "But I know this without her. I am not who I am. Without her, I would still be building walls." Silence fell, not the awkward kind, the reverent kind, the kind that lands on skin like sun after a long winter. Then came applause, not wild, but steady, long, genuine. Madeline didn't react immediately. She just breathed, then, quietly. As the room continued to clap and smile and shift with noise, she reached across the table and placed her hand gently on top of his. The movement was barely perceptible to anyone but them, but it held the weight of everything that hadn't been said. There was no sudden confession, no cinematic kiss, just her fingers resting on his and his thumb, brushing against hers. It was enough, because the spotlight may have found them, but their truth had been building long before it ever arrived. After the event, as chairs were stacked and cake slices were wrapped in napkins to take home, Madeline stood near the coat rack, watching as volunteers cleaned up quietly. Graham approached, coat in hand, scarf tucked under one arm. He didn't speak, just stood beside her. She turned slightly, eyes meeting his. "No interviews tomorrow," she said. "Agreed." He replied. A pause. Then she smiled. "You were brave today." He looked down at his shoes, then back up. "So were you." She slid her arm through his, an easy, familiar motion. Not for the cameras, not for the crowd, just for them. Outside, the sky had begun to soften into dusk. The snow had melted. Spring was waiting, and hand in hand. They walked into it quietly, fully, without fanfare. Just two people, no longer fixing the past, just building what came next. The last night of the year came softly, no fireworks, no champagne, no glittering countdowns. Just a slow snowfall outside the wide windows of the community center, and the warm hush of two people finishing their day in quiet sync. Madeline closed the file drawer with a gentle click. The final intake form had been entered, the desks wiped down. The lights in the main hall dimmed one by one. Graham stood by the coat rack, his sleeves rolled up, carefully folding a stack of flyers advertising a January legal clinic. Neither of them spoke much. There was no need. The rhythm between them had long shifted from questions and answers to something quieter. Shared tasks, glances exchanged mid-motion, the kind of ease that can only be built, not spoken into being. The clock above the entrance clicked past 9:00 p. "I think we've officially done enough for the year," Madeline said softly, dusting off her hands. Graham looked up, met her eyes, and gave a slow nod. More than enough. She reached for the main light switch, but paused. "Wait." She walked toward the front lobby, where the large community bulletin board hung. Thumbtacked across its cork surface were dozens of notes, some typed, some scrawled on napkins, sticky notes, even the backs of grocery receipts. "Thank you for listening. You made me feel human again. I didn't know I had rights. Now I do." Madeline traced one corner of a note with her fingertip, the edge curling slightly with time. She didn't cry. She just breathed in the proof that quiet work could still echo loudly in someone's life. Behind her. Graham had walked closer, standing just a few feet away. "You never wanted any of this," he said. She turned. "No," she replied. "I wanted to disappear." A pause. And did it work? She looked around the room, the soft green walls, the crooked lampshade no one had fixed, the dried flowers in a jar by the window. Then she looked at him. "No," she said, "but maybe I was never supposed to." Outside, the snow thickened, catching in the streetlight glow like falling stars. Graham offered his arm. Madeline hesitated for half a second, then took it. They walked through the hallway slowly, turning off lights one by one, the kind of ritual that felt sacred, even if it was ordinary. In the staff kitchen, she emptied the last coffee pot. In the intake office, he straightened the chairs. When they reached the front door, she slid the lock, then paused again. Graham reached for the final switch, but before the room went dark, she turned to face him fully. There was no speech, no grand gesture, just her hand, reaching gently for his. Their fingers found each other the way people do when they've walked far enough together to stop asking why. There were no apologies, no guarantees, only presence, only peace. And for both of them, after years of building walls, losing ground, being misunderstood, this was the softest kind of miracle. They stepped outside together. The snow was thick now, but gentle. It reminded them of the night everything had started, not at the gala, not at the accusation, but at the first quiet moment when one person had looked at the other and really seen them. Madeline adjusted her scarf. Graham pulled his coat tighter, and without speaking, they began walking down the street, past shuttered shops. their footprints stitching a new story into the soft white earth. Not one of rescue, not of romance, even, but of something rarer. Two people who had found their way out of themselves and into something steadier. Not because they had been believed by the world, but because they had finally stopped needing to be. Inside the locked center, the small desk lamp in Graham's office still glowed faintly through the blinds. It would flicker out in an hour, automatically, just enough light to make the night less alone. And somewhere, on a shelf behind Madeline's desk, tucked inside a folder no one else had touched for months, was the invitation from that first party, creased, slightly yellowed, still intact. She hadn't thrown it away, not out of sentimentality, but as a reminder that belief isn't given, it's built. And sometimes, all it takes is someone believing enough for both. Sometimes, the quietest lives carry the loudest truths. This story reminds us that value isn't always loud, and worth isn't always seen right away. Madeline didn't need a title or a stage. She found strength in showing up, in staying kind even when others weren't looking. And Graham, a man of power, finally learned that control doesn't build trust, vulnerability does. We live in a world that rewards speed, noise, and confidence, but real change often begins in stillness, in showing up again and again, with integrity. There's also a deeper lesson here. You don't have to be believed by the world to be at peace with yourself. You only need to stand in your truth and let the right people find you there. So, if you've ever felt overlooked, dismissed, too late to start again, remember this. Healing is not about proving others wrong. It's about no longer needing to. And when love or belief arrives, not with fanfare but with presence, that's when you know. Thank you for spending this quiet moment with us. If this story touched your heart, reminded you of something true, or simply made you pause, please consider giving it a like, sharing it with someone you care about, and subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us continue sharing gentle, meaningful stories that speak to the soul. Until next time, stay kind, stay curious, and never stop believing in quiet strength.